Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is temaniadams, and this is my recap of day 17 of the R. Kelly trial. Today's recap is sponsored by All Things Plus, where plus-size women can get all their cute gear. So let's get started. The judge, as I previously posted earlier today, they came out. The judge gave an order on a motion in limine that had been filed about some videos and an audio recording that the government wanted to introduce and the defense wanted to keep out. They did not play the videos or the recording today, but from what I gathered, the video has something to do with the sexual activity of the man Alex. And that is not his real name, by the way. That's an alias that they use for court, and several of R. Kelly's girlfriends. And the audio recording is something regarding him yelling or possibly abusing someone in his home. The judge also talked about the jury charge and told the parties, they've already submitted their joint proposed jury charge. And let's back up. The jury charge is basically the instructions that the jury gets for when they go into deliberation. So it talks a little bit about the law, what the burden of proof is, what the government must prove, and then it has the standard guilty, not guilty, all those things on it. So they already submitted that pre-trial and that standard, but during trial, we always have to do a final version. So the judge was saying that if they wanted anything to be added to the final version, that she wanted it by Friday. That is an indication to me that they plan on wrapping this trial up within the next week or so, because you don't ask for the jury charge or any addition to the jury charge if you're not close to the end of the trial. So the witness on the stand today was still Miss Mayweather. She was one of R. Kelly's assistants. Her sister also worked for R. Kelly. And she talked about how his girlfriends would go up to him and kiss him whenever he came into a room. She also talked about the Sprinter van, the tour bus, things like that. One thing that got talked about a lot was these text messages between her and her sister about Azriel. And Azriel, during trial, they called her Jane. But the text messages were about Azriel being on the tour bus for days and days and days and days and days. So she didn't know exactly why Azriel was on the tour bus for those days. Neither did her sister. They kind of insinuated that she was on some type of punishment. But R. Kelly's defense team brought out that she was still in school and she had to graduate and she needed to finish her work so that she could graduate. And she did end up graduating. So that was that. They also talked about when she quit her job working for R. Kelly. There was a situation where they were at a concert of his, Miss Mayweather and a couple of R. Kelly's girlfriends. There was a small altercation where the person escorting them to their seats was kind of too close to them, and Azriel told Miss Mayweather, and Miss Mayweather told Azriel, like, the tone that she was using wasn't appropriate. Don't talk to her like that. Long story short, Robert said that it didn't matter what Miss Mayweather said, he was always going to believe his girlfriends because his girlfriends don't lie to him. So she just went ahead and quit that night. She later she was later offered her job back, not directly through Rob, but her sister called and said that Robert was willing to offer her job back. There were certain terms that had to be agreed to, and one of the terms that they wanted was for her to work for 6 months with no pay, which is absolutely absurd. There was also talks about her getting phones for a lot, like for some of the girls. She had a phone for Dominique before, and that, the girls were free to, they had their phones. There was no lock on the doors. She never saw him hit anyone, abuse anyone. There was conversation. She was saying that on the tour bus, the girls were like urinating in cups. And she was saying she knew that the girls were doing that. But on cross-examination, Mr. Koenig, R. Kelly's defense attorney, brought out, how did you know that? And she was like, I knew. But she never saw them, urinating the cups. She said they disposed of the cups, but that doesn't really mean anything. She said she never saw them urinating the cups. She never, touched the cups. She never smelled the cups. So she kept saying that she knew this, but she had no basis to establish how she knew it. She was also kind of getting a little hostile on cross-examination. There was questioning about her bringing a artist, or wanting to bring an artist, Kim Burrell, who was an older artist back in the day, to R. Kelly to possibly audition for him. There was some back and forth about that. She was saying that no, the government report was wrong. Kim Burrell was already a national artist, and she took Kim Burrell's information to some guy named Percy, and Percy took it to R. Kelly, so on and so forth. But the government report said something a little bit different, and she said the government didn't get the report correct. And there were some other things in other reports that she said that also was not correct. So there you go. Other than that, she also talked about, there was also questioning about when Azriel would talk to her parents. In one of the reports, she said that the conversations seemed to be happy, but she said that she didn't remember saying that the conversations seemed to be happy. So there was just like a lot of nitpicking about things that she'd said in reports. Like I said, she got kind of hostile. The purpose of her role, that was also brought up, because it was like her purpose of her role seemed to be to run errands for R. Kelly's girlfriends and things like that. But it also came out that initially she was supposed to be taking a young lady named Summer and making sure that she got to her doctor's appointments, because Summer was pregnant. I don't know who Summer is, what happened to this baby. But initially when she interviewed, there was talk about her taking Summer to her doctor's appointments, but that didn't end up being her role. When she did work for R. Kelly, she took his girlfriends wherever they needed to go. And when they talked about the shopping trips, the girls had their own money. And when there was like a male sales associate, the girls would give her the money and she would pay for the services or whatever it was, because that was just kind of one of Rob's things. But other than that, there was not too much there. The next witness was Nicholas Williams. He was 19 years old when he went to go work for R. Kelly. He wanted to be a musical engineer, and he got an internship at Chicago Tracks Life Studio. He worked there for a year. He worked there 3 months as an unpaid intern, and then he worked there 9 months as a paid, almost like an assistant receptionist, and he was only paid $6 per hour. And I think at that time, the testimony was that the minimum wage was $6.15. But he agreed to $6 an hour. He worked the night shift. He worked about 14-hour days, and it would frequently turn to 16-hour days because the person who was coming to relieve him was often late. So he ended up quitting, and we'll get into that in a second. But he was originally really excited to work at the Chicago Track Studio, which later came out that Chicago Track Studio did no longer exist. R. Kelly had purchased the studio just for him, so he could record. And that's when it became the Chocolate Factory. And he also called the studio in his home at some point the Chocolate Factory. Another young man who worked for R. Kelly years ago at the studio of his home testified about that, I think on the first week of trial. So he talked about what his duties were. He ran errands, answered the phone. And one thing was, when someone called for Rob, he would take their information down, and if he didn't know where Rob was, he would go around, he would find him. Let's just say he was in the studio. He would go in, he couldn't speak to anyone, and he would just kind of stand there until he was acknowledged, and then he would give Rob the paper with whoever's information on it, and Rob would say, okay, either he'll take the call or he wasn't present, or to tell them he wasn't present. He also, there was also some back and forth about whether or not the girls upstairs could roam the home, roam the studio, if they had to knock on doors, were there locks on doors, things that we've heard like time and time and time again at this point, from my point of view, and I'm pretty sure from the jury's point of view, like we're beating a dead horse. The witness, Mr. Williams, he got a little combative on cross-examination, because he said that he ended up quitting because he'd worked there for a year and he had even touched a piece of audio equipment. It came out that he had talked with the engineers in the studio, but they never asked him to, move up or do anything. So I think what I gathered from that was that he wasn't good enough. But Koenig, Mr. Kelly's attorney, didn't just go ahead and say that. And the witness, he said that R. Kelly was angry all the time, and that he was nervous when he first came in to testify, but he was happy because he was going to be finally able to look R. Kelly in the eyes and say whatever. He didn't even get to get it out because Koenig objected, which was the appropriate thing to do. And the judge sustained the objection, called the lawyers up front, and instructed the jury to disregard what he said. So I don't know what R. Kelly did or did not do to him, but he definitely had something to say to him that he didn't get to get out. One thing that he also talked about was during the time that he worked for R. Kelly was married, and there were like girls upstairs in the studio. So when R. Kelly's wife was coming to the studio, his wife had a driver that drove her around, and when her driver or assistant, whatever the term was bringing her, they would call the studio ahead of time. And he would write importance on the sticky note and go find R. Kelly. And so important was his name for his wife. So let's just say his wife was going to be there in 15 minutes. Per Mr. Williams, he would write important and I guess 15 minutes or whatever it is on his little pad and go find Mr. Kelly and take it to him to let him know that his wife was coming. And so that's another reason he was saying he was quitting, because he was like, I wasn't doing anything but helping him, cheat on his wife or whatever the case may be. But the witness was combative. He was telling Mr. Koenig on cross-examination, once he said you aren't asking the right question, he became really combative, and he really didn't have to be. He said that he once heard sex and yelling noises at the home, and that's pretty much it. Oh, he also talked about blackouts in the studio. And the blackout in the studio was when there was to be no movement. So he had to stay at the reception desk during the blackout, and the people upstairs the girls couldn't move around. And he also testified that he couldn't interact with any of the girlfriends of any of R. Kelly's girlfriends. And he it really seemed like he felt like he wanted, or he should have been able to talk to them, like he was entitled to do that. But yeah, he felt some type of way that he wasn't able to do that. But he did talk about other artists coming to the studio with him being able to interact with them. And by interact, it wasn't like they were having full-blown conversations. It was like as far as greetings, hello, how are you, type of things. And so he did talk about other artists coming to the studio. He said that Tyrese came, B2K came, Beyonce came, Sylvester Stallone, and members of the Cash Money Millionaires. So he was like, no, you could interact with them. So he didn't get why he couldn't interact with the girlfriends. And so on cross, Koenig brought out that, no, you were just greeting them. And he was like, no, you could ask them how they were doing. They would talk to you. So this employee seemed like really entitled. And yeah, I can see why he no longer worked there, because you're an employee. You don't get to decide. Like, you don't get to make the rules about anything. Like, that's just weird. So after that, they made lots of stipulations. So stipulations are basically agreements. And let's just say, and I used this, I used this analogy earlier about when your client is charged with, possession of a firearm by a felon, and he has a really bad crime that made him a felon, and you don't want that to come out for the jury. So you will stipulate that, yes, he was charged with a felony and he was convicted. So they did a lot of stipulations, a lot. So they did them. The prosecutor read them into the record, which is basically she read what they stipulated to the jury, and that was it. The next person was Ryan Shibo. He is what I would call the case agent. He works for Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, and they have those throughout the U.S. In I think with the trafficking team or trafficking investigations. So this is another reason why I think that he's probably going to be the last witness for the government, because in cases like this, and I've had cases where there's like lots of evidence, the case agent is either the very first witness or the last witness. So in this case, the government made him the last witness, and that wasn't a good idea. He definitely should have been the first witness. And I'll tell you why. So he did surveillance on rkelly a couple days before he was arrested, and there were search warrants done. He saw Robert and his older brother George Kelly talking one day, and they showed a picture. And there was a backpack that Robert had, and we don't know what was in the backpack, but it came out that when they went to search the storage and his home, they couldn't find the backpack. But either way, that's pretty much the start of his testimony. He talked about going to the apartment at Trump Tower and searching that apartment. What they found, 4 iPads and several phones. And they also searched a storage unit and found iPads, phones, and hard drives. So we all know that Alex and the other witnesses testified that Mr. Kelly would save a lot of his sex tapes on iPads, which has to be the dumbest thing ever. Like if it's a sex tape between consenting adults, that's one thing. But if you know that there's a possibility that there may be allegations that you are doing something wrong in recording these sex tapes, or people were unwilling or whatever it is, definitely do not record yourself doing things that could get you arrested or get you in trouble later on. And that's just common sense. But there were several iPads, several phones. Some of the phones, it appeared that there were some of the phones that he given Barry's girlfriends, and he just, instead of destroying them, he just kept them with all the information on them. So from there, they got lots of records. Basically, a lot of the records or information that was in the storage, this witness was there to so that the prosecutor could admit them to evidence. So let's just say he found this iPad in the storage and XYZ was on the iPad. He would have to be the witness to introduce that into evidence because he was the one that found it. So the bulk of his testimony today, which was no testimony, all these items were found, they were introducing all into evidence. He probably said only a few words. Most of it was the prosecutor talking and admitting all of these exhibits, and that's what we call pieces of evidence, into the record. So some of the exhibits was a certified record from BET, which was a brief recording from an interview R. Kelly had with BET years ago about Aaliyah, and that he was working with her, so on and so forth. They only played a small clip of it. The next was a physical copy of the Age Ain't Nothing But a Number album. R. Kelly's on it. He's the producer on it. That was that. Next, they had these certified annulment records from R. Kelly's marriage to Aaliyah. Basically, they were married August 31st, 1994. The marriage was annulled. They wanted that to be August 31st, 1994, saying that they stopped living together August 31st, 1994. Basically, that, that the marriage was by fraud, and that they had not cohabitated, so on and so forth. The prosecutor continued to read records reading the documents that they had gotten out the storage into evidence and reading several stipulations into the record. So the last probably hour and a half or so, maybe 2 hours, was just that. A lot of people were falling asleep, and it appeared that R. Kelly was falling asleep for a little bit too. So there were also lots of FedEx envelopes in this storage unit that were super old. And these FedEx storage envelopes had message papers from phone calls. So, and I think you all have probably seen them if you had some type of job back in the day, and you write, oh, this person called, this was their number, this is what they said, and put the date at the top. You can get those anywhere now, like from Office Depot. So it was a ton of those, but like from 2002, 2003, like super old. And foolishly, these were from some of the girls who have now testified against him. So I don't know why these were kept. They all should have been shredded because he had no reason to keep records from phone messages from almost 20 years ago. And it really came to bite him in the rear end because it established that these girls were calling and leaving messages for him, so he couldn't really do much. There was also like records, business records brought in from Walgreens. Long story short, R. Kelly had herpes, and some of the girls had herpes, and they were getting their prescriptions. No big deal. Other than that, there was a handwritten letter from Azriel, who was again referred to as Jane in the trial, about R. Kelly helping her in her song and her singing and him testing her and all that good stuff. And other than that, it was just crickets. Hopefully this witness will get done tomorrow and can get off the stand, because by the government putting this witness at the end, what we essentially have is it's the end of the government's case. People are exhausted, and all of a sudden, the witness isn't even talking. The prosecutor is talking, just reading, and people are zoned out. So we call that like, hey, you're losing the jury, because at some point, people get tired of that. It would have been great if they'd done this in the beginning and put all these records in the beginning, because then once these witnesses were called to testify, they could be cross-examined on this information because it was already in evidence. But because it was not already in evidence, these things, the witnesses could not have been cross-examined about these things. So I really think that was something that was asked backwards. But I believe the prosecutor called him last because the case agent sits in the courtroom and listens to all of the evidence. So that, let's just say, a witness testifies wrongly, or there's something that the government wants him to say or needs him to say. If he testifies last, he's taken everything in and got all his notes in, so that when the government questions him, he knows all the things that he needs to say. However, like I said, this is like definitely turning the jury off, because no one's testifying. They're just reading, and he's just sitting on the stand. And yeah. So either way, I hope this is the last witness for the government. I sincerely hope so. He didn't have much to add. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So tomorrow there is court. I will only be there half a day. The court may only be half a day. There'll be no court on Thursday and a full day on Friday. I will be going back home tomorrow to Texas. I have my own clients to deal with. And that is my recap of the R. Kelly trial, day 17.